You're sitting by a dying fire, somewhere in what is now Botswana. Roughly 40,000 years ago, it has been 3 days since the man who should be sharing this fire with you was supposed to come back from a trip east, and there is no way to check on him. No last seen timestamp. No little green dot next to his name. No way to see that he read your message and simply hasn't answered. There is only the dark past the firelight, and the question of whether the person you were counting on is dead, hurt, or just late, and whether it's worth risking your own life to find out. For most of human history, that wasn't a hypothetical. For roughly 300,000 years before writing, before farming, before anything you'd recognize as a village, your ancestors lived in bands of 20 or 30 people, and their survival depended constantly on individuals who did not share a drop of their blood. That single fact quietly breaks the story you were probably taught about prehistoric life. That loyalty stopped at the edge of the bloodline, that strangers meant danger, that it was every family for itself. It wasn't, and it didn't. And the reason it wasn't is the same reason you feel a small, specific sting when someone you like leaves you on red. If you weren't related to someone and there was no law, no money, and no way to hold them accountable except your own memory of how they'd treated you before, why would you ever trust them enough to risk your life for them? Here's a clue. In some of the last hunter-gatherer societies left on Earth, anthropologists have traced objects, strings of ostrich eggshell beads mostly, that traveled well over 100 miles from where they were made, passed hand to hand between people who sometimes never met at all. Nobody was trading those beads for food. They were trading them for something closer to insurance. And the story of how that system worked turns out to be the same story as why you still feel it every time a friend goes quiet for too long. What exactly were they insuring against? And why does some part of you still feel it 40,000 years later, every time someone you like stops replying? Here's the assumption almost everyone makes without ever really examining it. That ancient social life ran entirely on kinship. Your bloodline looked out for you, and everyone outside it was, at best, tolerated, and at worst, a threat. It's a tidy theory, and evolutionary biology even gives it a name. Kin selection, the idea that helping a relative helps your own genes survive by proxy. Here's where it falls apart. In 2011, anthropologist Kim Hill and a team of colleagues published a study in the journal Science after analyzing residence data from 32 hunter-gatherer societies around the world, from the Ache of Paraguay to the Hadza of Tanzania. They expected groups built mostly around close relatives, the way almost every other social mammal organizes itself. Instead, they found that in a typical band, fewer than 1 in 10 of the adults living and cooperating together each day were closely related to one another by blood. Most of the people your ancestors ate with, slept near, and depended on to survive were not family. They were something evolutionary biology doesn't really have a clean, tidy word for. They were friends. That's not a footnote. It's a structural difference between humans and almost every other social species on the planet. And researchers now argue it's old enough to have shaped human cooperation itself, long before agriculture gave anyone something to trade. So here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. If you're not risking your life for a sibling, what stops the whole arrangement from collapsing the first time someone doesn't return the favor? The clearest answer comes from a practice still alive today among the Jew/Hwansi of the Kalahari, documented across decades of fieldwork by anthropologist Polly Weissner. It's called H-Ksaro, a system of gift-giving between chosen partners, often people living dozens or even close to 200 kilometers apart, with no blood relation at all. You don't xero with just anyone. This isn't the Stone Age equivalent of accepting every friend request that comes your way. Partners are chosen carefully over years, and gifts move between them with no fixed schedule and no set value in return. What's actually being built isn't a trade relationship. It's a claim on someone's future generosity, banked for the day your own water hole runs dry and you need somewhere else to go. Wissner found that the average adult maintained around 16 of these partnerships at once, layered outward from camp to neighboring camps to people 100 and more miles away. A personal safety net, built gift by gift, tested for years before it was ever actually needed. That's the first loop closed. Ancient humans didn't just tolerate non-relatives, they deliberately cultivated long-term, high-investment relationships with them, on purpose, as a survival strategy. Centuries before anyone had a word for friendship, let alone a group chat to maintain one. And the stakes for getting it wrong were never small. Ethnographic accounts of hunter-gatherer life describe a fate most modern arguments never come close to: quiet, creeping exclusion. A person who kept taking without ever giving back could watch their partners simply stop showing up, one waterhole and one camp at a time, until there was nowhere left to turn in a bad season. With no police, no courts, and no way to force anyone to help you, being cut off wasn't an insult. It was closer to a death sentence handed down slowly by people who just quietly walked away. Some part of your brain still treats it that way, even now, when nobody actually starves from being excluded. In 2003, psychologist Naomi Eisenberger and colleagues at UCLA put people in a brain scanner and had them play a simple ball-tossing game with two other players. In reality, a computer, programmed to slowly stop passing the ball to whoever was in the scanner. The moment the exclusion started, the scans lit up in the same regions the brain uses to process a broken bone or a burned hand. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula. Being left out, it turns out, is not just a figure of speech. On some level, your brain reads it as an injury. That's not a coincidence, and it isn't a flaw in the wiring. It's the same circuitry your ancestors needed to take social bonds exactly as seriously as physical ones. Because for most of human history, breaking one really could kill you. But choosing the right people to invest in was never obvious, and it still isn't. There's a piece of this story most people have never heard. How did your ancestors know who to trust in the first place? With no resumes, no reviews, no mutual friends to vouch for anyone, and no 3-week trial period to figure out if someone was worth keeping? In 2012, researcher Corin Apicella, then at Harvard working with sociologist Nicholas Christakis and colleagues, mapped the actual friendship networks of the Hadza, one of the last populations on Earth still living primarily by hunting and gathering. What they found was almost unsettling in how familiar it looked. Hadza friendships weren't random and weren't simply about who happened to live nearby. People consistently sought out others who matched their own level of generosity. Cooperative people clustered with cooperative people in patterns that held up with a statistical precision that wouldn't look out of place in a modern social network study. In other words, like attracts like, and it apparently always has. The slow, half-conscious calculation you run today, sorting out who's actually going to show up for you, isn't a modern social skill layered on top of older instinct. It is the instinct. It's why the friendships that feel effortless are usually the ones where both people were already playing by the same unspoken rules, and why the ones that don't tend to quietly fall apart after a run of favors that only ever flow in one direction. None of this came free, of course. Choosing badly could get you killed, and choosing well took time nobody could afford to waste, which is likely why evolution built in a shortcut. Not a checklist, a feeling. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar at Oxford has spent decades mapping exactly how the human brain manages this. His research suggests people can maintain roughly 150 stable relationships, the number now known unimaginatively as Dunbar's number. But that outer circle is really made of nested rings. About 5 people sit at the very center, the ones you'd actually help move apartments for. A wider ring of around 15 would get a call if something went badly wrong at 2 in the morning. Beyond that, a looser 50 make up the people you'd call your actual tribe, day to day. And only past that does the number swell to 150, the point past which you'd merely recognize a face at a funeral. Dunbar's work also points to the mechanism running underneath the math. Laughing, singing, dancing, and swapping stories around a fire all trigger a release of endorphins that functions like social glue, chemically welding exactly the bonds your ancestors needed to survive. Not a business transaction, then. A feeling engineered by natural selection to feel like one of the best things that can happen to you. Because for a very long time, It also happened to be one of the only things standing between you and starving alone. Here's the part that's easy to rush past. All of this, the careful gift giving, the sorting of who to trust, the wiring underneath both, had to exist before language got sophisticated enough for contracts, before farming, before anyone could write anything down. You couldn't sign an agreement with your hunting partner. You had a feeling in your chest, tested over years, and it had to be reliable enough to bet your life on. Which brings us back to that flicker of unease when a friend goes quiet on you for 2 days. It costs you nothing today. Nobody starves because a text goes unanswered. And yet, the feeling shows up anyway, wildly out of proportion to the actual stakes, because the circuitry running it wasn't built for text messages. It was built for a world where a broken bond could mean facing the next bad season completely alone, and it never got the memo that the water holes don't run dry anymore. Somewhere in that slow accumulation of gifts, trust, and shared fires, we became a species capable of loving people we share no blood with, enough to build entire lives around them. We built alliances the same way we build friendships now. Slowly, unevenly, mostly without noticing we were doing it. And we've been doing it so long and so automatically that most of us have never once stopped to ask where the feeling came from. You're still sitting by that fire. It just looks like a phone screen now, and some old, patient part of you is still running the same quiet calculation it ran 300,000 years ago, asking, without asking, whether this is a person worth staking your life on.